So let me just say again, I'm really honored to be at the Bush School, the Scowcroft Center. It's, you talk about two of the most distinguished Americans of leadership and high caliber, certainly in, that I can recall. And it's, when you look at the institution, Texas A&M University, and how it's known internationally as being such a fine institution. The only possible source of irritation I have with Texas A&M is when it left the Big 12 to go to the SEC. But even that, I think I could put aside for a little bit. But for the purposes of tonight's presentation, I just want to say I'm really honored to be speaking at the Bush School and Scowcroft Center. It's just an amazing experience for me. So thank you very much, Professor Olson. Lauren, I wanted to thank you for setting up, and Sally as well. Thank you very much for your organizing this. So what I want to talk about today is, and I've got some notes. I'd like to speak rather extemporaneously, but I do have some notes that I think will guide me during this course. But I am really looking forward to hearing your questions as we proceed on this evening. They can be general in nature, or you can talk specifically about the topic at hand. What I really think I want to do is talk about AI, not in the sense of artificial intelligence being the subject matter for what we're going to be discussing, but using that as in the age. I want to talk about the age of AI and how we're going to conduct human operations in that. So it's not about algorithms or anything like that. It's about how are we going to conduct the business that I was a part of for so many years, that Jim Olson was a part of for such a long time. Things have changed quite a bit, and I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a historical context of where I think they are. And towards the end of the talk, I'd like to give you an idea of what I think is where we need to go. Not necessarily where we are or where we're going, but where we need to go. So let me just say, from my perspective, I admit I'm out now, a little less than a year. I would tell you that I think the business end of conducting human operations, human intelligence operations, is facing challenges, but not just challenges. I think significantly greater than challenges. I think human operations, how we conduct human operations, is frankly facing a business line problem. What I mean by that is, if you look at HUMINT as being part of the many ints that are out there, HUMINT is frankly, given where we're going, in my opinion, this is just solely one man's opinion on this, is actually potentially facing a relevance problem in the next several years. And I'm going to explain to you why I think that. And what's ironic about that, in my mind, is right now and in the years to come, although the practice of conducting human operations is really under threat by some of the technological and other issues that are facing us, the need for human operations, for information derived from HUMINT, I think is growing. It's actually accelerating. In the age of AI, when so much data is being consumed by so many people across the globe, intelligence agencies, businesses, governments, et cetera, the biggest thing I think that HUMINT is going to solve are the seminal issues, the critical issues of saying, who's behind some operations that may be being conducted against us? Why are these operations being conducted? And who is directing these operations? Too often in a cyber context, we look at cyber as being patching a problem. We don't necessarily go and say, how is it technically conducted against us? I would submit to you that what we really need to answer those questions is not look at it as merely digits, ones and zeros. Just the opposite. I think we have to go back and actually strengthen the HUMINT enterprise to get down to what is the most important things. Now, for tonight, I just need to tell you that when I was in the agency and I was leading officers, what I always told them is, don't just identify problems. It's not about identifying problems. You should always identify problems, which I'm glad to look at and say they're problems that we need to fix. But more importantly, give me some solutions. What are the solutions we need to do to solve those problems? Tonight am going to violate my my edict that I previously gave to my officers, because I'm going to probably offer more problems than I am the solutions. But I do want to discuss these issues and raise them. I'm going to alert you to what I think are some issues facing the human enterprise. But I'm not here to criticize or slam anybody in the previous organization or anyone across the IC. This is just about saying what some issues that I think are arising, and frankly, I think it's understood by a lot of people within the IC, but not necessarily everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And the final thing I'd just say is, by way of background, is every single thing I'm going to talk about today is clearly unclassified. As much as I'd like to talk about in some depth on things, I do need to let you know that I'm going to be offering my thoughts and observations that come from my years of observation and something you likely read on the internet. So again, let's talk about background on HUMINT. Everybody's aware what HUMINT is, human operations. It is, as they say, the second oldest profession on the planet, trying to understand what adversaries or opponents or other governments, other tribes, other towns, other nations are doing, so you can anticipate what they're going to do, get ahead of them, and either prevent prevent something from happening, or actually giving you the information you need to do something that you could actually conduct. So my experience when I'm talking tonight is I'm going to talk a little bit about my reference point of when I started. As Professor Olson said, I started in '94. I went down through training in 1995. I then went back to the training facility in the early 2000s after some service in Afghanistan. And I was an instructor there for a little over 2 years. So about 10 years after I went through the farm, I went back there and taught. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about where we are now. So basically, we're talking about 95 to 2005, and then 15 years later in 2020. So when I was both a student and an instructor, we really, I don't think the course had changed dramatically since Professor Olson had gone through. Human operations was about understanding the psychology of the person you're working with, the person you're dealing with, the person that's across from you, understanding their motivations, understanding some vulnerabilities that they might have. What is it that makes them, what is it that drives them? What is it that over time, if you work this case properly, would incentivize them or to lead them to actually do something that in almost all cases is very bad for their personal well-being and health. So that course is still being conducted in that same manner. And really, because this is human operations fundamentally is about human. It's about interactions with humans. And oftentimes, I think over the course of the last several years, to the negative flip side, or excuse me, on the negative side, is that we've forgotten that in some ways. Human beings are at the root of human operations. Technology is not completely at the very root of it. It's still basically human. And we needed to put human back into human operations. So if you go back to 1994, when I went through the course, we basically trained how to do all of these things that I'm talking about, how to spot somebody, how to assess them, things that you've probably all heard throughout your coursework or just reading newspapers. And back then, or the internet, and back then, we primarily geared our officers, young officers like myself, junior officers, to go out and work in an embassy environment. Embassies were the primary platforms. And by day, if you're in most cases, not necessarily in mine because of some having been involved with a trader, was one of my instructors at the farm. I went out declared on my first tour. In most cases, junior officers would go out integrated in various other positions. So they're trying to live a life that says by day they're a diplomat or they're doing something, they're living their cover, they're integrated in something, and by night they likely would have been out there doing their primary job, which is to conduct the operations, which is to go out initially when you arrive, spot, assess, develop, eventually recruit, handle, and it always happens at some point, terminate that relationship at the end of a certain period of time. So training revolved around some areas that I think largely have been done for years and years. We learned how to do foot SDRs being a surveillance detection route, how to craft those routes, vehicular, foot. It was a very rearward facing when you're conducting vehicular or foot or surveillance detection routes. You're aware of what your surrounding is, but you're looking around what primarily it's who's behind you, who's the trailing surveillance. And you're looking possibly to see where static surveillance might be. Or you're looking to see where there might be zonal surveillance and how you could break that to identify it. Where someone's going to stay in the zone and just let you drive, and then you can go to the next bubble, which is filled with surveillance. In a lot of ways, we had to teach that. We taught that in a manner which provided deception and misdirection. Because in most cases, you don't want your officers to be driving around and to identifying themselves as doing an SDR, because then you're saying, they are not what they appear to be, which we wanted them to appear to be, which was your average officer. So that deception, that misdirection was a key facet of the business, how we managed to prepare our officers to go overseas. In addition to the AMS portion, the agent management skills, and developing commo plans, writing reports, practicing good CI and security, like Professor Olson was once upon a time in charge of CI. Counterintelligence is a big part of what we do. But a vital aspect of that was maintaining your anonymity. Don't be alerting. Keep yourself, unalerting, so so people will have a long or a difficult time trying to identify who was the officer in an embassy that may or may not work for the agency. So live within your cover. Basically basically over time, I always looked at it like this: an officer who strove to maintain their cover and do their job, more or less could probably have three tours where they could go out and work in that fashion. Beyond that, after a while, you start kind of sticking out a little bit like a sore thumb. And then that does not mean that's the end of your career. Then you still continue to go overseas, but possibly working in a manner where you'd be dealing with the services that might be the services around the country in a liaison capacity. So it wasn't like that's the end of your career, just the opposite is where it actually began. So think about why we took so much time and effort and all the costs we did to train officers to maintain their cover and be able to protect their identities is because of the sources. We did not want them to be easily identified, head out into the world, and have someone hang back and potentially over time identify patterns of activity that could potentially lead to the person that they were either meeting or developing. So we took great care to say that live your cover. But you think about it at the time, in those constructs back in 1994 and then later in 2005-ish, we did not face the challenges that we're facing today. And some of those challenges make maintaining that cover, living your cover, being non-alerting, extremely difficult. Speaking of difficulty, being an officer overseas in the agency, an agency officer, has always been extremely difficult. It is not just because of the evolution of this technology and what we're facing now, big data, et cetera. I'm not going to say it is more difficult now, but it's always been difficult. And there's those that said, those that don't think it was difficult, I think was some of the officers we had in the organization that often had flaps because they didn't treat it with the seriousness with which they should have. Think about it being extremely difficult and you're ramping up your level of tradecraft, your security and your CI awareness is up. Those were the folks that by and large were successful. Those who didn't think it was successful, difficult, often I think fell into a pattern of regularity that became predictable. And that's a danger. So I just want to point out that I've read an article or two that talks about how much more difficult it is now for democracies to work in undemocratic countries. Partially, I would agree to that. It's always been dangerous. And it's always, frankly, in my mind, been easier for our adversaries to conduct espionage activities in the United States or within NATO countries because we have rule of law. We have principles. We cannot just flip a switch and make a company work for us. We have processes that we go through, and they do not. And we, even when we're conducting business overseas, are very focused on following the law. So it's always been difficult, but I just want to point out that it has gotten worse just since I was down as an instructor 15 years ago. Let me tell you about another place that I went to work that Professor Olson talked about with being a big denied area. I'm not supposed to say where I was, and I've pretty much held to that. But for the sake of this conversation and this august company, I will say that it's an evil empire, and I think they still speak Russian there. So I was boss there, and I could tell you what we had to experience there was something that I never thought was possible. And I just wanted to juxtapose this, and I hope that hopefully there's some folks from the Bureau that are in this presentation this evening. I have enormous amount of respect for the special agents and other folks that do counterintelligence here, counterespionage in the United States. But I can tell you that they're not resourced anywhere near what our adversaries resource. 2014 to 2016, without getting the specific numbers, but we could estimate thousands of our adversaries keeping track of a total American presence in that country, around 350 serving officers and another 500 or so family members. The embassy was only about 350 people. That included 3 consulates that were basically very small. But inside that, they to discover, to penetrate that embassy community, thousands and thousands of thousands of officers from a service that was monitoring us placed a great deal of emphasis on determining who was who and what we were doing. And it wasn't just the agency, but it was the entire embassy community to be after. So think about that. Thousands of potential surveillance. They would do physical surveillance, vehicular, teams on the street, static positions, etc. Operations officers, camera operators, folks that manned physical observation posts, and most dangerous case officers. Most dangerous for me were the folks that I was most concerned with were, frankly, the analysts. And what I mean by that is this: at any given time, we may be able to conduct an activity, but what do analysts start doing on the day of the activity? You know, you could possibly do something, but 2014 to 2016, the advent of even more and more cameras and AI began to alarm me, because what analysts could do after an opportunity, what they could deconstruct, what they could begin to place together using some of the technology that began to be developed. And sadly, I think in some ways, it's dramatically turned even more dangerous for us, the human world, since even that time, and that's 4 years. So think about what I described to you when I said I was a student in tenure, what happened 10 years later. When I showed up at the farm and I was actually a student going through the course, we had dark rooms downstairs and we developed film by hand. We learned how to develop film and with chemicals. We went into the dark rooms. Less than 10 years later, all of my students had digital cameras that were probably this big, bigger than your iPhone, thicker. And that was a revolution, you know, but that take the card out of the phone, put it in a standalone, print pictures, et cetera. Now they've moved well beyond that, and it's even evolved that much quicker. That's just in the construct of how we were training students. So it's not just an internet problem is what I'm going to communicate. It's think about what's happened just since then when I was there. It's not just the development of the internet, but think about social media, smartphones, adware, the near perpetual surveillance state that we have, data sales, data mining, big data, et cetera. It's gone exponentially and it is increasing. It's an upward trajectory and it's moving faster than I think the world is adjusting to, at least in our world. So the accumulation of data is a remarkably scary thing that we need to worry about, but just as scary, if not more scary, are the tools that have been developed to actually mine that data and go through it, sift through, trying to determine who is who and what are they doing. Once upon a time, if you were going to go overseas and say you were to go to a country in South Asia, just picking any country, say it was India, I'm just picking that. There was a good chance in the 90s, the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, if you had come to Washington, you went through training, you were integrated in another agency, then you went overseas, it would be very, very difficult for any other country, whether it's Argentina, India, South Africa, pick it, to actually dig down deep and discover who you were. Find out where you've been, who are your friends, what is your credit history. Now, you know, your problems of becoming an officer within the agency, or I would submit that almost any intelligence agency now, start long before you even come to the agency. Your identity management problem doesn't begin once you join the agency. It starts well in advance. It's what happens when somebody reaches out for the very first time and makes contact saying, I'm interested in becoming an officer. In 1994, actually 1992, when I applied, I wrote a letter to an address, and then an unmarked letter was returned to me. Then as years went on, as the internet was developed, that then became initial forays for expressions of interest via the internet, leaving that as a telltale signature and a stream of emails going back and forth. Now, without getting into details, I think the agencies worked on that hard, and I think there's a number of companies that are trying to facilitate that to provide some cover. But my point is, in terms of conducting human operations and doing it well and doing it carefully, so much of that is going to be tied into what we discussed earlier, which is being able to maintain a status so you are not automatically lit up if you're going to be doing that. And if you are hired, what happens now when you arrive in Washington, D.C. area? What happens as you begin your career? What are the telltale signs that you are actually not what you are going to pretend you are? So if you think about your phone and what your phone is doing every day with adware and such, it's giving geolocation data, and you can actually you can geofence areas and see everybody who's inside of a geofenced area to determine who actually works there and who does not. You can begin to say who's within close proximity of you at any time. Who are those people that you surround yourself with? And if you're a young person and you move to this area, what are you going to do immediately is you're going to begin to hang out with other people. You're going to be your friends and future colleagues. What is that telling them about it? Well, what happens when you can't take your phone to work? What does that tell you if you leave your phone in your apartment or in a car, statically in a car, and it's not used for 8 hours during the day? What does that say? Inaction right now in this age is going to be as potentially detrimental as action. So I said before, actively you wanted to protect your cover, but there are times now where if you fail to do that, if you, think you're doing that to protect your cover, but you're actually doing something that is the opposite of what you've done for the better part of the last 10, 15 years of your life, that is also speaking volumes about what you may be doing, and that can be noticed immediately. So friends and colleagues, once one person's identified, given the amount of data that's out there in the world, once one person's identified, they can easily then begin to do a track back to see look for other patterns of behavior similar to that. So the world is a much more complicated place now. And there's so much more with the amount of data that's out there. What more is accessible? Financial information about all of us, credit information, our internet activity and history, social media postings. What have you said before? Where have you been? What have your interests been? Did you ever write a paper at Texas A&M about the agency or the intelligence community? Is that a potential indicator? Most of these things can happen. But we're starting to look for our adversaries' patterns of activity spread out over time. It is not just in the short period of time where you arrive, relatively short period of time, you're trying to maintain your cover in the first or in the 2 years that you're in assignment, that you can actually then begin to do your job. In certain ways, unless you're being very careful about it now, and we'll get to that in a sec, you potentially are undermining yourself before you even arrive at your first post. And that's a real concern. And I want to say about the concerns I have are not necessarily, I want to be very careful when I say this, are not necessarily about our officers. I want to go back to something. The concern about being identified as an agency officer. Astute services, and Professor Olson knows this, astute services are not necessarily going to identify an officer and immediately PNG them. Our officers could potentially get roughed up, and has been the case in the past, and you can see that on the news. But in most cases, well, in all cases, they're eventually, because of their status, going to be asked to leave the country. They leave relatively safety, and if there's a good operation and everything went, sometimes there's just a risk. Most of those officers will be welcomed home and celebrated. Who does not get that opportunity, particularly in hostile environments, are the folks that we would meet with. They're the ones that have the issue. So a good counterintelligence officer, one that's in their entire life, including one that I had multiple encounters with, he spent his entire career trying to identify what people like me and other folks were doing in his country. And that was his entire reason for existence, was trying to get into our inner circles and trying to figure out what our activity was and how we were proceeding. As that moved on, he became astute in knowing everything about us. So picture now what he would be able to do with some of the tools at their disposal. So our problem set is, overall, in my assessment, and this is not a criticism, there's a bit of a mismatch between what we know about the threats we're facing, and by the way, there's some opportunities in that realm too, and how we're responding to them. After 2010, the array of threats became really well known, big data, et cetera. I would ask, if you guys are interested, look up some of the writings of Bruce, and I apologize if I'm going to mispronounce the gentleman's last name, Bruce Schneier, Schneier, and Shoshana Zuboff. And they're both talked about in extensive detail about the surveillance capitalism that's out there in the world now, what some of the technologies are. And in many ways, I would just say that we are still, in some ways, fighting the last war. We've always been, you know, the military sometimes has been accused of that. I think in some ways we are. The way we hire, we onboard, we train, how we're locating people, where we're operating. Not in all cases, and again, this is not a criticism, but we're not up to the point of having revolutionized. We're still, in many ways, acting like we did 20 years ago. And the problem is sensors, data, numbers of companies wishing to exploit the data is growing, and we're not in a static problem. This is truly moving faster than we're able to react. So if you think about it now, there are 100 smart cities, capital cities across the globe that I'm aware of. There's even a capital city, if anybody's aware of South Sudan, excuse me, a smart city in Juba, South Sudan. I talked to the chief there once, and he was telling me that there had one street light, yet Huawei had installed a smart city in Juba. In the United States alone, there are 4,000 companies that collect, collate, gather, process, and sell data. 4,000 companies just in the United States. So where do we go from this? How do we fix this problem? How do we work on it? If there's not complete alignment with making the situation better, how do we do this so we don't render the collection of human operations obsolete and irrelevant in the next several years? I'm going to go through just some ideas that I was thinking of today that I just passed on for your rumination. I acknowledge again, in my opinion, HUMINT now is going to be more critical than at any other point in its history. Just because there's so much data right now, we need to know who is behind operations and why. So it's critical. There's SIGINT, imagery, open source, data collection has almost become overwhelming, and how do you collate, synthesize, and derive what is truly important? I still believe that that cycle of HUMINT, collecting HUMINT, is going to be essential. So in order to make it more successful, these are some things I would just ask you to consider as you're thinking, pondering these. One is to focus HUMINT solely on the most pressing issues, the most strategic issues, and narrowly scope it. In the agency, traditionally, and some other collection agencies, we'd collect on a broad range of issues that, given the threats that we're facing, I'm not sure that that is the way to go anymore, to really focus down on just a few particular areas and be prepared to accept. And this was always the case. When we tried to do that in the past, there would be a revolution in some African country, and immediately people would begin to scream intelligence failure. Be prepared to say the agencies, or excuse me, HUMINT mission of the United States now is not to focus on all things. Can't do it. Spread too thin. There's a finite number of countries out there, I think, that are significant threats to the United States. There's a finite number of issues, and I think we broadly need to focus. My suggestion, if I was still in the building. Boutique. The word's got to be focused on boutique. What I'd say is boutique tradecraft operations and solutions. Boutique in the way we hire, meaning it's not mass industrial scale. Boutique in the way we train, and the training can't just be conducted anymore at one location. And boutique in different ways to actually be more nimble, understand how we're going to deploy people overseas. There's great risks in that, of course, but I think that's where we're going to need to go to make this better. Identity management, number 3, has to be uploaded. You do not worry about cover after a person's already hired. We have to really get way ahead of this and start identifying people at the Bush School or something and talking to them about how and opportunities. And so nobody is placed in a position of where you show up on day one, you've already been in some ways compromised. The whole of IC, I think the DNI has to play, I believe, a bigger role in this. It's not about the director of the operations running tradecraft and improvement within the CIA, or it's just the CIA talking about how it's going to improve human operations. There are a lot of components, a lot of folks out there that are facing this in DOD, DIA, a lot of organizations that are facing these risks. I think we've got to do more emphasis to have better leadership emphasis on this from a community standard. Anytime anybody says whole of government approach or anything like that, normally I would recoil in horror, and a lot of folks would, but I do think in this, there has to be a firmer hand saying this is an issue and we need to fix it. I think oversight has to be more involved, and so that I mean by congressional and even in policymaking circles, to understand what the implications are if this incredibly valuable source of information is cut off. We need to educate folks on what HUMINT can do and what it can't do. It is not CNN. It is not Fox. It should not be, and sometimes people believe that the lack of understanding what human really can and cannot do is something that I think the community has to do a better job of saying, this is what we can do. And finally, I would say everyone in the IC has to have, I think, closer cooperation with the innovation sector. There's, great centers of innovation in Texas and obviously in Boston, Silicon Valley, increasingly in Minneapolis, across the country. What we primarily have in some ways is great connections to what I would say the big tech, big companies, but those are large bureaucratic organizations, much like the agency, much like other organizations, and their execution cultures more than they are innovation cultures. The IC writ large, in my assessment, needs to do a much better job of understanding what the innovation culture, innovation communities have to offer. We have to do a much better job. The agency has to do a better job. The IC does. I want to say the national security sector of the United States government of reaching out and doing a much better job of communicating with and absorbing information at a smaller scale. Can't constantly be seeking big industrial solutions. I would say go back to my comment on boutique earlier. There's a lot of folks out there that want to do, in some cases, some folks think, oh, nobody in the innovation culture wants to talk to anybody in the government. I don't see that as necessarily always being the case. I think it's got more to do with us doing a better job of actually communicating with each other and seeking solutions. So with that, sir, that's my 30 minutes. I tried to keep it down to 30. I hope I was. That is what I have to say, and I hope it was reasonably interesting to folks. I'm very, very interested in hearing your questions. Please fire away. I will ask, I will answer directly and with candor. And if there's something I can't answer, I'm just going to say I prefer not to answer that or something like that. But please fire away. I'm very interested in hearing what everybody has to say. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bruce. I think I'm glad I got out when I did. It's certainly a lot more difficult operational environment than I encountered and that you did earlier in your career. We got some very good questions that have come in from the audience, and I hope you'll continue to send them, and I'll pass them on as they come in. One question just in general about your career, what was the longest time that you actually worked with one asset?
I'm going to have to think on that. It's a really good question. There's several, I am being obtuse here. There's one of the great goals, I think, if you're an officer is to, if you meet someone and you establish that firm bond of affection that eventually leads to very good things. One of the things you'd like to do is be able to cultivate that relationship. It's not going to be a one and done. It's not like I pick up and leave, and someone would, that relationship would die. I think what the goal would be to say that could endure. That probably, with zero details, there was one that endured a little bit of time beyond my tenure, and that made me very, very proud. So it wasn't just me directly, but it was also others. But then you get the opportunity to still have some input and demonstrate to the person that with precision that periodically you could go back and say, I'm still here. I still love you. I still miss you. I'm still with you. I'm part of your life. And I think that has a hugely favorable impression on some of the folks we work with when they don't feel that they're just being passed along like, trash. And that makes a big difference to them. And it's always it was always a great, remarkably motivating thing for me to be part of something like that with people I knew before.
Good. How closely are we collaborating with our close allies, for example, within ICA in the UK and Aging 2.0 in Australia, across the board in AI, but for example, in protecting elders from ransomware attacks?
Yeah, I think the level of cooperation, it doesn't wax and wane. It does, unlike political or diplomatic relations that I always saw, it does not wax and wane as dramatically as I think in diplomacy or in government-to-government relations. If you will recall back in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq back in the early 2000s, there was a great deal of of anger, consternation in Europe about our activities there. If you recall, that's when we were going to stop calling things French fries. We're talking about American fries, things like that. It really deteriorated. One thing that I think the agency has, and matter of fact, I think intelligence services, professional, good intelligence services have, is the ability to maintain strong cooperative relationships even during times of tumult. And the reason is diplomats in the department, and I'm not taking this away, you're representing the outer face of the government and whatever position that government has at the time. So they're going to have demarches, they're going to have various diplomatic language that will be used, something that could convey outrage, but it's very subtle. In the intelligence world, I never found that to be the case. When I went and met with liaison, it was always very direct, very, calculatingly direct, and they knew where we stood, and we were able to sometimes act as a back channel, if you will, to understand what was happening behind the scenes. But political problems will come and they'll go. There's some problems now I probably we're facing without getting into the politics of this in pre-election, but in some diplomatic relations are low ebb. I can say that when I left, the organizations that we worked with, our closest partners in NATO, in the Five Eyes community, were extremely cooperative. And beyond that, there were others eyes that I saw developing, and we often talked about, in addition to the very much familiar Five Eyes. Actually, if I do have to have a shout out, I believe I've never had friends outside of the organization before, except for one guy, and he's actually a Five Eyes guy. And, he's from north of us, and I wanted to say hello to him because he said he wanted to come in and sit on this, so he's on there too. But besides the Five Eyes, by the way, he says okay. His wife and kids are American, so it's all right. Besides the Five Eyes, there were other layers that would go, and there were some that I think were immediately behind Five Eyes. Some, you could call them 6.5 eye, or somewhere in there, and then it goes on. You would be surprised how much cooperation there is, even amongst between services, even when countries don't necessarily get along. That's not always the case. I can think of a country where I served in Africa where it's absolutely not the case, but and that's a good thing, because at the end of the day, we have common threats. There's a CI threat from an adversarial country in some cases, counterproliferation issues, counterterrorism issues. There's always room to cooperate in those realms, and you don't want that to trail off because of poor relations on the diplomatic front.
Okay, Bruce, what blocking mechanisms have been developed to protect the U.S. from AI attacks by our adversaries?
No, you're getting us. I apologize, Professor, and whoever asked the question. I would love to. I'm not going to be able to answer that in any specificity. Or there's two reasons for that, and I just have to be candid. One is I'm not an expert in that, and two, that what I do know is something that I don't really want to get into, if you don't mind. And I apologize. I said I'd try to be as forthright as I could, but.
I've got another one you can't answer.
Okay.
How can the CIA even operate in Moscow and Beijing in the age of cameras, sensors, and other surveillance systems?
Yeah, I'll answer that, because I think this is a case. What I defined before, what I've defined in my, I think, alarming presentation earlier, and I hope it is a little bit alarming. I think we need to wake up and think that this is a serious threat. But people always ask me that, and this is not just talked when I was there 4 years ago. You would be surprised. You wouldn't be. I hope you would not be surprised. You would. I hope you'd be proud, and everybody at Texas A&M University and friends of Texas A&M are, I hope, extremely proud of the men and women in your intelligence community to go to these countries and serve. I can tell you I can almost bring tears to my eyes now thinking about some of the operations, some of the things that my young officers accomplished through creativity, aggression, absolute surprise, and I'm trying to think of there's several words I could use that I just do not want to use in a forum like this, but with absolute precision, discipline, aggression, being masters of their time, some deception. Now it's getting harder. And what I said is the relevance pieces I'm worried about is in the next several years as the capabilities continue to accelerate. But I can tell you that all that are listening to this, I would hope, would walk away with a great sense of pride in what our American officers do. Do we always win? No, I can say that. There's guys, I mentioned an adversary who's no longer in the organization, but he was retired, but formidable guy. Likely would have stabbed me in the eyeball with the pencil if he could have at a certain point, but he was formidable, and we had to constantly be on our very best. And when you talk about a place like Moscow, or you talk about a place like Beijing, or you talk about other places that are denied areas like that, what really sets them apart in my mind is the precision, discipline, and ingenuity that come from young officers. They're the ones that know everything. They're the ones that are out on the street. They're the ones that got to know where there's breaks in coverage or get something like that. They're the ones that are there watching. And it is those young officers that I think we have to, how do we conduct those operations? It's because of them. And that's something I would hope everyone would walk away from this presentation tonight feeling good about.
That's very good to hear. I'm going to combine a couple of questions now, Bruce. What is your advice to young people out there who have already established a large print through social media, other internet sites? And then also in relation to that, how about people who were exposed in the OPM data breach? How hard will it be for young people like that ever to serve undercover?
It's a really good question. And I said, I want to harken back to what I said at the beginning. I said, I told my junior officers, don't come to me identifying problems, come to me identifying a problem and a solution. Mm-hmm. So I've identified a couple problems that I'm not immediately going to say, and this is where I'm not being obtuse, it's just because I don't know at this moment. I would say what we cannot do. There are threats there, and I always said the difference between possibility and probability are two different things. And we need to be aware of that. And I've gotten chastised recently when I said that somebody's saying you're an idiot because you're not recognizing the smaller what you thought of as a probability is actually here and occurring. Because we would identify things that could possibly happen to any one of us. And then I'd ask the questions, well, can we do that to the adversary? And I'd be like, well, no, it's much harder. Then how can they be, you're telling me they're much better than us? I really found that to be difficult. So on a probability scale, probability was low, but there was a possibility that it was there. Over time, probability has begun to increase as well as possibility. So, well, what does that do? Does that mean we automatically shut down our operational initiatives? Am I one to believe that the presence of officers in platforms like official platforms across the world is over? No, not at all. I absolutely don't believe that. What's going to require us to continue on is the evolution of new, innovative, courageous tradecraft coupled. And who's going to do that? Again, I'm going to go to the younger officers that are going to be coming on board in the next few years. You can't necessarily erase your past. You're out there. You are absolutely known for who you've been, politically, socially, what it may be. For you to now try to change that up, I think is likely a fool's errand, but B, it goes back to anomalous behavior. I think until we can find the innovative ways, and there's some out there that would be able to allow you. There's some companies like in the DC area that are working on identity management solutions that are doing some really innovative things. I mean, some folks, frankly, Professor, that you knew from before, really doing some innovative stuff. We have to though devote resources, time to that, and create that times or case studies where we can actually use that type and be confident that when we use it, the payoff's going to be worth it. We have to take a lot more risk, in my mind, in some ways, good risk, not bad risk. If you were to say it's too difficult now, if you were to say that what's threatening us is so looming and so overwhelming, then we're done. What you need to do is actually say, okay, it's there, it's real. Now we're going to attack it. And we don't go on the defensive. Once you're in a defensive crouch, it's very difficult to get out of that. What you do is constantly, if anybody's, texts in a big school with the military, such when you're hit and you're ambushed, one of the first things should go into your head is, should I counterattack? I'm going to charge into the ambush. That's how you defeat the ambush. You just don't crawl into a ball and get shot. What we have a tendency to do sometimes across the federal government is to go into that defensive crouch. Something bad will happen. And I'm sure you saw it back in your day, sir. I saw it then, boom, we need to stop. We need to regroup, stop, everyone stop. Yeah, I got it. That's smart. But I was much more when I was on board, much more in the mindset that we will learn from this, but I do not want to recoil into a defensive crouch that will stop all our momentum. And just because one thing goes bad in one area does not necessarily mean it will go bad in another. But we have to be mindful that there could be ripple effects. So getting back specifically to your question, I am very concerned. I just outlined my concerns earlier. So it doesn't mean, however, that I'm suggesting that it is impossible. We will work through this. Anyone that's interested in joining the organization at some point will still have a very productive and positive career. I said 2 to 3 times where a person can go out, likely previously, and work in an undeclared or integrated fashion before. I went out on my first tour because Harold James Nicholson, if anybody's familiar with him, was my primary homeroom instructor when I was going through the training. And he identified me, and I was supposed to go to a certain area and did not go. So on my very first tour in the former Soviet space, I went out as a declared officer. That was 1997. Wow. Did not impact my career. So there's all kinds of ways, and I was able to do a number of successful things. So what you just can't do is paint yourself into a corner of inactivity, because then they win, right? Who are the theys out there? Identify who they are. Don't let the theys win. You have to be very specific, and you have to take some risk. This is a business that's based on risk, and risk is not a bad thing. Risk is a good thing. Risk motivates you. Risk keeps you sharp. The guys that have failed, and I said this earlier, are the ones who thought it was easy. Then they're the ones likely, and from my business, who actually were kind of sloppy, made mistakes. I'm sure you saw that, where tradecraft became vanilla, or was repeatable, whereas patterns developed over time. Nothing can kill a human operation, in my opinion, more than a lack of discipline, slothful training or planning, and repetitiveness. It's very bad. You've got to constantly innovate. And I'm sure it's a great thing about having young guys coming into the organization constantly is the digitally native, I believe is the term, generation of American patriots that are going to come on board are going to actually be part of that solution. And that's really pretty exciting, I think.
It's nice to see so many students here tonight, and I've received several questions from them about what your advice would be to them if they aspire to careers in the intelligence community. What hard and soft skills are most important? What are their techniques that they can employ now to make themselves more attractive for employment?
When I was an instructor at our training facility, I always used to get a little, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm in public. Upset. When I would see, sometimes we would have students come on board from very prominent universities, some of whom were very great students, became great officers, some who were, I think, hired because of profile that did not necessarily turn into a really good officer. And I don't know why, and I say this with respect, I don't mean this with any kind of disparagement, because I always used to say that I would rather have, in certain cases, a 2.91 Western Michigan University political science major who was either president of his fraternity or her sorority, who did everything they could possibly do in, including class president, intramural sports, etc. I want to go back to what I said earlier about human. We need to put the human in HUMINT. Technology does not eliminate humanity from a HUMINT mission. Technology can either impede human operations or can help accelerate them, but it does not necessarily mean, it does not take the place of it. It does not supplant that. At the basis of human is getting an individual to risk everything they have to provide that critical insight that we're not going to get from the other ints. That critical ability to go back and say, what exactly, tell me. And you're sitting there looking at a person in the face and saying, is this really, what does this really mean? I'm not saying it's more important than anybody or any other int, but that's the differentiator, I think, between HUMINT and others. So if I were looking at it, I think now younger officers, I'd see some of whom are taking courses down there, either undergraduate or graduate, you have significantly more technical acumen than I ever had, that I ever will have. And you're bringing that. That it becomes, where I said earlier, that digitally native, it's part of who you are far more than it was me. I had to learn how to develop film. Then I quickly forgot it. I'm not one to this day. I say this with some, technology in some ways scares me just because I don't, I'm not reading. I'm very good at ESPN.com. I can get to CNN.com, that kind of stuff, but I'm not one that's really going down the technical rabbit hole. You bring that, I think naturally, a lot of folks bring that now just because of how society and technology evolved. What you don't necessarily bring, however, is the people skills that I think you need to make sure you develop, you train, and you hone. I was not depressed, too strong a word. I was disappointed that I too often saw with younger officers that were coming in the agency, frankly, an inability to hold genuine long-term conversations, to place their needs, right? Their needs behind the most important thing, which is the person on the other side of the table. That's what matters, and your ability to understand and have the patience to strike up a relationship and conversations with individuals who you have an agenda with. And if you cannot do this, if everything is a truncated LOL, OMG, whatever else it is, TikTok type relationship based on that, then I think we're also in trouble. That's not putting the human back in, humanity back in human. You have to have that skill. So your ability to make relationships, establish deep bonds of affection, understand who the person is, what makes them, again, what motivates them, and why might they be a bit vulnerable, and how can you entice the motivation, never use the vulnerability. But in order to do that, you've got to talk to people. You just can't sit in there in these kind of, phony, truncated, technical jargon conversations anymore. And I have found that with, folks, again, it saddens me at 56 years of age that now I'm that old guy talking about these young kids. It makes me, it's the cycle of life. And I'm sure Professor Olson was talking about these young kids. And I'm sure when he joined the organization, somebody's saying these young kids. That is the history of humankind, right? I remember reading an article written by a New York Herald Tribune author talking about, as he was going into battle with some young guys going into fight the first battle of a war, how they were the most frivolous idiots listening to their stupid music and da-da-da-da-da. In actually two cases of this. One was when we were going into the 1st Marine Division, landing in Guadalcanal, and the other was when Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders were going into Cuba. So that history is replete with examples of saying, this generation. But I am cognizant of, and I think it's proven out that we do need to, I think, develop better communication skills. So if you bring that in and you can show that you are, wanting to listen and think about the other person in great depth, I think that's going to help you enormously. I think if failing that, I think you're going to have a hard time.
Okay. Don't take this question personally.
Not at all.
But the question is, are intelligence collectors particularly prone to conspiracy theories?
No, I'm not taking that seriously at all. I would say just almost 100% the opposite. I have been utterly amazed, shocked, frankly confused at times over the course of my being exposed to the agency and the intelligence community and the national security apparatus, why people seem to believe what they claim, or what they believe about how the agency is responsible for this or anything else. In my bottom line opinion on that is, if people actually understood the way the building worked, I think they'd be shocked. The building, and I know you're nodding there, Professor. It's like there were times where I expected somebody to tap me on the shoulder and say, "We've been watching you for 20 years. We'd like you to join the real agency now." It's very hard for any United States institution to keep secrets. We are not, and by the way, culturally, and I'm so proud of this, thank God, we're not a culture that likes secret organizations. You know, we're just not as a people. Unlike other places where I've worked, where it's just inculcated into their societies, right? There's going to be a big strong man. Somebody's always watching. We're not like that. So if we're not like that, and we constantly face problems of keeping secrets, where very few things stay secret on big issues. I mean, cases, not particular cases or something like that. But why then would somebody think that there are these great depths of hidden conspiracies that are out there? I was recently on an app. Somebody introduced it to me. It was a friend of mine who's out in Silicon Valley. I got on there and I actually posted who I was. You can open chat rooms and you can go in and people just talk to you and it's all verbal. And then I haven't been on it since, because I was cornered into, it wasn't a conversation. I was looking for a conversation. I was actually cornered into a position of having to explain why I did not for 1 second believe that the agency introduced crack cocaine into the United States. And no matter what I said, trying to be reasonable and saying, can we talk about this reasonably? And here's why. It was answered with, that's of course what you're supposed to say. That's why I believe you're lying. And it was just like, okay, I got it. This is not going to be an argument. It's a conversation. So there are tons of people out there that believe in conspiracy theories. I think there's elements of that we can see today. What is possible, what is not possible. I think that I think intelligence officers, particularly good ones that I've known and met, worked with, this is not only in the United States, but I'd say some of our closest partners that I've had the privilege of working with are some of the most clear-eyed, strategic thinking people. We look at I was always really impressed. Again, it doesn't mean that we don't have some winners, some opposite of winners. There's plenty. But when you have a clear-eyed, steely-eyed professional looking at facts that are in front of them based on the information at hand, then in my estimation, they were some of the finest strategic thinkers about where American policy would be going, because we're not tied into, emotionally tied into what another government might be saying, something like that. It doesn't mean there's not problems too, because everybody don't fall in love with your assets. Don't fall in love with your liaison. That can also happen. But that's why I go back to saying, if you're steely-eyed and you can sit there and discern between what is real and what is nonsense, you're really, really powerful asset for the United States.
I wish we had more time. This has been tremendously interesting. We'll have to invite you back, and hopefully in person next time. But one last question, and then you can have a wrap up if you like, Bruce. But
sure.
The question is, what is the history of that picture on the wall behind you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. So that is a painting, a very famous painting. And I can't think of his name right now, who the artist is. But it was during the Soviet realism painting, back in the mid-30s, and I can't think of the name of the painter right now. But it's a famous painting of Stalin and Minister of Defense Voroshilov walking along the ramparts of the Kremlin. So there's significance, and I never really fully understood it. There's significance in part of the gate is gone, things like that. So when I was leaving Moscow, my station had this painted for me. And there's my face where Stalin's face used to be. And the guy the other guy was my main enemy there, a guy named Zhomov. And that's his painting. That's his face over Voroshilov. That's Zhomov, that's me. And is there something else you can see behind me? There's another one. So you know, there is a camaraderie even amongst adversaries in our world that is unique in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a respect. I did not like him. He did not like me. My job was to do what I had to do to him. His job was to try to stop me. And out of that, at a minimum, I think we didn't have to like each other. But I think there was a mutual respect. So I sent a copy of the photograph of this. I took a picture of this and sent it to him. And I said, basically, just take this as a token of appreciation and know that you were always in my thoughts. And he responded in kind and said, you were always in my thoughts too. You know, good luck, that kind of thing. So again, we were not by any stretch of imagination buddies. I don't ever want to talk to him again. I'm not wishing him ill will or anything like that, but he was a man responsible for a lot of pain and suffering. But in his mind, he was responsible for heroic action. Yeah. So, you know.
Well, it's a coincidence you should mention Jomov today, because Mel Bearden spoke to my counterintelligence class today, and he talked about the Prologue operation, how that came from Jomov and how brilliant it was.
GT Prologue.
Yeah, and how much respect that he had also for him as a counterintelligence professional.
No, he was a guy that there was not a day that I did not get up thinking about, you know, what would Jomov do today? You know what I mean? And I wanted him to think of me that way. I wanted him to be afraid of me. And I had strategic advantage in surprise. Yeah. He has strategic advantage in being 30, I don't know, do you know, Jim, of 35, 40 years, basically doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Every single thing, every single officer that ever come into that place, he'd seen similar behaviors. They had book and book and book. And that's the greatest single advantage that they have is time, patience, analysis. Start stacking all this other stuff we talked about on top of it, extremely formidable. But I would still, to answer a question previously, I would still match our folks with their ingenuity up and over time that we'll beat this. We need to make sure our game is really, really on.
Good. Well, that's absolutely great, Bruce. Do you have any final words that you'd like to leave with the group?
No, I just say again, I want to thank you. It's a real privilege. I mean, it's sincerely privilege is not an overused word with me. It's a real privilege to be able to talk to the esteemed institution, Texas A&M, the Bush School, and the Scowcroft Center. I would say that these are tough times. I wanted to offer some things that I think could be fixed over time, that could be corrected, that could be emphasized. I'm an optimist by nature. I would say that anybody that's American that's sitting here looking, anybody that may be in your class from, I don't know, a foreign country that's allies with us, be proud of those guys too. There's a lot of good work being done in the world. There's nothing that the United States of America cannot accomplish and its citizens cannot accomplish when they want to accomplish it. I would just say, even though I'm no longer with the agency, I still have a lot of friends working there. And I can say with absolute certainty that you have much to be proud of. And I just want to emphasize that again. And if anybody's got any questions for me, anything, please feel free to reach out through Lauren or you, Professor. I'd be happy to talk to somebody in the future as well.
That's very nice. And we will invite you back. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Scowcroft Institute. And thank all of you for being with us tonight. It's been a real pleasure. Good night.
Okay. Thank you so much.